point of view. One of the things that was really bizarre was that folks thought that they were invisible. They experienced this kind of idea of invisibility, and we were like, with a 4-foot mohawk, how can you be invisible? And we never really noticed that until we were in the editing room. Our biggest concern in the production was that people, the general public, would be playing to the camera or interrupting or somehow interfering, and it didn't happen once. It was just sort of like that concern was sort of misplaced, and the degree of their invisibility became much more profound in the post-production when you really see that they're rendered invisible.
Well, I think simply for me, the idea of a public is any shared space or context, and I don't really separate myself from that in essence or in practice. And my work tends to hover very close to the humble, although with grand aspirations, and I assume that that's true for all the other citizens as well.
Hold on. There's some mics down there.
Are they on?
Yeah.
Okay, is that okay? Okay, well, I think it's interesting that the term the public and the notion of the public embodies so many internal contradictions, because we tend to think of the public in relation to citizenship, and the subject of the citizen is the subject of a nation state, and yet we also use the word the public in relation to the people, which is often used to express the idea of the downtrodden, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized. And I was glad that Brad brought up the notion of invisibility, because I think what is really interesting to me is to think about secret publics, those that are not acknowledged within this complex of citizenship, especially because citizenship is so tied up with economic power. Citizenship has become, in a way, the power of the purse, rather than the status of a person. And I think that's one of the main things I'm interested in looking at, is bringing forward the secret publics or invisible part of the public that have sort of lost their agency and their status as persons because of their lack of power within our capitalist economic structure.
Okay, I'd like to turn it to the audience and see if people have questions of the public related questions. Yes. Oh, actually, should we bring the mic down for people to? Or maybe I can repeat your question so the people in the back can hear. Go ahead.
My question is for Andy, but I'm interested in the other artists responding to it in relation to their own work. And it has to do with the Yes-Men's utopian turn, the difference, the impact on the public, that your reflection on that from the first piece, that kind of piece where you're embodying the dystopic, the extreme dystopic corporate evil versus behaving as having the corporation take responsibility and act as you want them to act in the world. I find the first one incredibly entertaining and powerful statement, but there's something about this new turn that seems to have a new kind of power. And I see all of the other work is related to that in creating space for voices that aren't visible, imagining neighborhood cooperation and expression, just this utopian kind of vision, making space for how you want the world you want to be in.
Did everybody hear that, or should I repeat it? I think it's incredibly powerful to, sometimes just say the obvious, answer. Everybody knows what we should do, and yet we're constantly told there's no alternative. Well, there's tons of alternatives everywhere, taking care of the Bhopal site, or it's not actually linear in time. We keep doing we've done the utopian thing 3 times, and the other funner thing maybe 6 or 7 or 8. But the most recent kind of utopian thing we did was as the Department of Housing and Urban Development in New Orleans The real HUD is demolishing public housing at a time when it's needed. And so one thing we announced as HUD was that we were not demolishing it, but then we outlined a bunch of other things that we might as well do at the same time, like establish a national tax base for schools so that they're all kind of roughly equal, and instead of based on local taxes and therefore poor where communities are poor, and things like that, just basic things. I mean, we all can see these things, and yet there's this big system that says, no, you can't do any of this. So it's kind of more powerful.
But you said less fun, more fun. It's like it's more fun for you to embody the evil corporate power. But what about your sense of how it impacts the public that you're speaking to, or?
Well, it doesn't impact the public that we're speaking to at all. But that's not really the point of our stuff ever. I mean, it is in a way, especially with the kind of utopian things. We hope that, especially with the BBC thing, I mean, the idea was like millions of people are going to see that it's just obvious that Dow could do the right thing and will demand that Dow will do the right thing subsequently. So it's potentially much more powerful. But all of these things we're videotaping and editing into a movie right now. So really the point of the satirical things is as part of the movie, really, where people in audiences will see that there's a problem. Because these people that we assume are kind of paying attention, who are at the core of the private or the market, are not paying any human attention, not sufficiently anyways. And so the movie kind of progresses through this storyline that's completely constructed, but it goes through these things and ends up in New Orleans with HUD not demolishing public housing and so on. So that's how they function. The immediate audience never gets it. Initially we thought they would, and we thought we'd shock them out of their worldview. And that hasn't happened a single time, of course.
No, I was thinking that perhaps because we want to make sure lots of people get to answer, so we'll just kind of cut it to a couple of people unless someone desperately wants to answer.
So the question of the public and utopia? Or?
No.
No?
There's a brand new book out called Nowtopia, I believe, on Amazon, just published this month.
Well, I think maybe, I haven't read that book, but that
It's brand new.
sounds interesting. One of the sections in the project that E.G. showed part of is called The Public Secret Utopia, which is a kind of aporia. And thinking about utopian visions and utopian goals, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that we tend to build utopias that rely on the disenfranchisement of others. And, there's a wonderful Ursula Le Guin story called The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas that sort of outlines that, how the utopian village is dependent upon the incarceration of a child who's left in very degraded circumstances, and they all know about it, but they don't want to acknowledge it, because if they acknowledged it and if they freed the child, they know somehow that the utopia would dissolve, the utopia that they live in would dissolve. So I think it's an interesting aspect of different definitions of utopia. I like really utopian projects that put out a utopian view of something that could occur, like the Dow chemical commercial. But I think underlying that is another kind of critical notion of utopia that's important to acknowledge.
Free marketers, free market ideologues, of course, also are completely utopian. They have this idea that all you have to do is take away government and everything will be wonderful. Mm-hmm. We've talked to them. They're featured important characters in our film.
Mm-hmm. I guess, sorry.
Yeah.
What was that?
So.
Great for them or great for everybody?
Everybody.
No, great. I think great for them.
What film did you it's in the film?
Oh, that we're making. Yeah, from those things and other things.
I said